Welcome to Food Friends, a podcast inspiring home cooks to try new dishes in the kitchen by sharing trusted recipes, tips, and friendship. Hi, I'm Sonia.
And I'm Carrie. We met in Los Angeles over 15 years ago as personal chefs and haven't stopped talking about food since. We're so glad you're here. Hi, Sonia.
Hi, Carrie.
Sonia, today we're talking about the spring farmers market, and I'm looking forward to all of these different veggies and fruits that are coming into season.
I know it's a little different up here in the Northwest, and it's different in California. It's different in the South. It's different in New England. So depending on where you are, and of course in other countries, it's going to be entirely different. But there is so much to get excited about at spring farmers markets. There's some things that seem to be everywhere, things like fennel and different kinds of greens and arugula, leeks, those and beets. And then there's some specialty things. Here we get nettles and incredible rhubarb and ramps and certain kinds of mushrooms.
And we have all the different kinds of citrus that come in, which you guys don't really get a lot of citrus.
No, citrus is really for warmer climates. We have one farmer who's growing citrus, and with climate shifts, people are starting to grow citrus in Oregon.
I think spring is such a time of rebirth and hope, and everyone's kind of ready to put their root vegetables away. And there's something sort of fresh and new about these flavors that we're really looking forward to.
Yeah. And there's a dish I want to talk about that incorporates a couple ingredients all at once. So again, a sheet pan meal. You know how we love a sheet pan meal.
Love a sheet pan meal.
Yeah. In fact, last night I made a sheet pan meal. I really make them a lot. And there's this great recipe developer and food stylist, Susan Spungen. She does a lot of food styling for movies, and she also writes recipes for the New York Times. And she has this recipe from a few years ago for asparagus, leek, pea, sheet pan gnocchi.
Oh,
It actually makes me think of you because I know you'll use those packaged gnocchi to do a one pan sort of meal. You've talked about that Brussels sprouts dish, which is so incredible. And this is such a similar concept. You make it with packaged gnocchi, although she does recommend buying the refrigerated packaged gnocchi instead of the
interesting.
pantry one.
Okay.
However, she doesn't say that's essential. So I think probably the shelf-stable one is a lot more cost-effective. And then the other thing about it is she cooks everything on 2 sheet pans, which is maybe slightly more work, but it really makes sense. And she even tells you you're going to put 1 sheet pan on the lower shelf and 1 sheet pan on the higher shelf. And that makes sense to me too, because the way things cook at different parts of the oven. And also sometimes when a thing is underneath another sheet pan, it steams a little. So the gnocchi get tossed in olive oil, salt, and pepper, and they get put on the bottom rack of the oven, right? That makes sense in case
That
they
makes
get
sense.
Yeah. And then on the top rack, you put a sheet pan with sliced asparagus, sliced leeks, and onions or shallots. And that also gets like olive oil and some salt and seasoning. You roast the gnocchi a little bit longer than the vegetables as well. And then at the end, you can kind of combine everything together. This is the real tip. And I think this applies to any sheet pan meal and a lot of spring vegetables. After you've combined everything together, then she hits the pan with freshly grated lemon zest and freshly grated Parmesan. And that's the whole meal. But I think even though it sounds so obvious and simple, right? Lemon and Parmesan is not an astounding flavor combination, but the technique of get it hot first, then out of the oven, that oil from the lemon zest is going to really hit and become fragrant, as opposed to if you do it before it gets roasted, then it will kind of get lost in the roasting process.
Yeah. And I love an experienced recipe developer because these tips, like putting it on 2 sheet pans instead of 1, when you're roasting those gnocchi separately, you're going to get them more crispy and they're going to have a better texture when you add all those soft vegetables to it. And I think you're right that lemon zest and olive oil, these are not like revolutionary ingredients, but when you're talking about spring vegetables, you're highlighting the spring vegetables. So I don't want to be tasting a bunch of spices when I've got incredible asparagus. Where do the peas go on?
This whole time I was like, I forgot to mention the peas. So 5 minutes before everything's done, you add the frozen peas. And she specifically calls for frozen peas. Now, you and I know that peas emerge at the spring farmers market, but I almost always find frozen peas are better than fresh peas.
I completely agree with you, Sonia. I think they're always sweeter and they're easier because they're just always in your freezer. And I imagine that this would be the tip that you put them on at the very end because you're really not, you don't even want them really cooked. You just want them to be a little bit warmed up so that they're the same temperature as everything else.
Yeah, exactly. And fresh peas tend to be a lot starchier. So they're not as tender. I think because they probably blanch the frozen peas before they freeze them. So they're already a little bit cooked, which is why you just need to heat them through. You're not trying to cook them.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, Sonia, the first recipe that I want to talk about is also a recipe that includes a mixture of spring vegetables, and it's called a spring veggie vignole, which is basically a one pot Italian soup that has spring vegetables in it. And what I really like about this is that it's not meant to be shocking green. You're sort of stewing your vegetables in a flavorful broth and you're getting them soft, and they're going to be darker green than if you're blanching asparagus. So this is pretty simple. You really just start with some olive oil. The Italian recipe calls for a pancetta or a little prosciutto, like a little bit of that porky flavor. But if you wanted to keep this completely vegetarian, you could add something like fennel along with your onions. You could add some leeks, some garlic. You really just want an aromatic base. And then you add some stock. I would use vegetable stock here, and that's what the recipe calls for. But you could definitely use a light chicken broth if you wanted it to have like a little bit more flavor. You add your vegetables kind of according to how long they would cook. So this recipe has artichokes in it. So you would start with the artichokes and you would let those cook for a little while. And then you can add your fava beans and cook those for about 10 minutes. And then you add some greens like chard, and then you add your peas at the very end, like your sheet pan meal. When you go to serve this soup, you hit it with a little bit of your really good fruity olive oil and maybe a little bit of grated Parmesan or pecorino, but you keep it really simple. And then add a showering of herbs like mint, dill, parsley. I also think if you were using fennel in here, this is a great place to put those tender fennel fronds.
This theme of sort of keeping spring vegetables simple, I think that's why recipe developers struggle with spring vegetables because you don't actually want to do crazy things to them. You mostly want to roast or blanch or even shave them raw, and then lemon, olive oil, salt, pepper, some fresh herbs. That's all plenty, especially when you're coming out of winter and wanting vibrancy. I like the contrast of sometimes you want something bright and fresh, maybe raw, and sometimes you want something that's cooked a little more lovingly, that really becomes tender and silky. And the soup, I've never had it, but it's something I would definitely try, and sounds so, so delicious for the April evening or for hosting.
It's really it's less of a recipe and more of an idea. You're cooking things into in a flavorful broth and then serving them as is. And I think it's also worth adding if you're not so sure about an artichoke or you don't have them, you can also use frozen artichokes. You could use frozen fava beans. You could use frozen peas. If you're really not willing to wait and they haven't come into your farmer's market yet, you could still easily make this.
Yeah, speaking of artichokes, artichokes are definitely one of my favorite spring vegetables easily. And I years ago, it was one of my first blog recipes that like people really responded to. This was years and years ago, maybe 10 or 11 years ago. But I started to cook my artichokes differently than how I was raised. My mom used to always make artichokes the same way, which was delicious. I'm not knocking this, but it's either steamed or boiled till it's soft. And then you would serve it with mayonnaise or butter or something to dip it in, right? An
Yeah, that's how I
aioli.
do it. That's really the
Yeah,
only way I cook artichokes.
nothing wrong with that. In fact, I love a good steamed artichoke. But I also was like, okay, well, what else can I do? And I just discovered, which I'm not the only person to have discovered this, that you can just roast artichokes. You can cut them in half, scoop out their choke, the little furry bit. You can trim the pokey parts too if you want or not, but just cutting them in half is the important thing. And then what I did is I put them cut side down into a baking dish, squeezed a ton of lemon to help them from going too brown, salt and pepper, olive oil, and again, cut side down. And then I covered the casserole dish, or it could be
Really?
like a covered pan. Yes, because they roast and steam at the same time.
Oh,
And
wow.
as you do it for long enough, the bottom browns. And so you get this really caramelized bottom to the artichoke, but it still gets totally tender. And that sweetness that comes from the caramelization, it's almost also like when you have a grilled artichoke, that flavor without
Yeah.
getting out your grill. You don't have to cover your pan. That's just how I was doing it. You absolutely actually can roast an artichoke uncovered. But I also love this idea for a sheet pan meal because I often see artichoke chicken sheet pan meals, but they're often using frozen artichokes, which again, if you can't find an artichoke at your farmer's market, that's a great option to use. But I love the idea of taking a fresh artichoke on a sheet pan meal with chicken because it will take the same amount of time as a big piece of chicken leg or chicken thigh, especially if it's bone in. And then you can kind of roast them together. And then the artichokes sort of absorb some of that roasted chicken flavor. And of course, lemon is always welcome for both chicken and artichokes. So, yeah, I just love roasting artichokes this time of year.
I roast so many things. I've never thought to roast an artichoke. And for a few years, I grew artichokes in my garden. And they're such a mysterious and strange looking vegetable. And they're also so pretty. And then I'm always like, oh my God, what am I going to do with all these artichokes in my garden? The thought of just kind of hacking them in half and putting them on a sheet pan that sounds amazing.
Yeah, it makes it super easy. I love growing artichokes. I had a couple bad ice storms kill off my plants.
Oh
And so
no.
it was like 2 years in a row. But anyway, neither here nor there. But also, if you're growing artichokes and you can't eat them all, letting them flower is so beautiful and it attracts so many bees. I love those purple artichoke flowers, are just some of the most beautiful things in the
They're
world.
so pretty, and they also last for like a couple of weeks. Like
Yeah.
they'll last cut in your house for a while too. I love that. Sonia, I feel like we can't talk about spring veggies without talking about asparagus. And I think asparagus is really great with pasta. And I found this fantastic recipe from the food writer Faith Willinger. She's a very well-known Italian cook. And I actually found the recipe in my favorite cookbook, which is called The 150 Best American Recipes, although it's been widely shared online. So we're going to link to it.
We have to mention that this was one of your favorite cookbooks that you shared. And we got so much feedback that no one had ever heard of this
No one had ever
cookbook,
heard of it. Yes.
which I had never heard of it. So it's an amazing cookbook. I'm so happy that you helped us discover it. We'll link the cookbook, but we'll also link this recipe so you don't have to
It's
get the cookbook.
Exactly. And it's one of those really simple Italian dishes. It's really just pasta, asparagus, olive oil, and a little bit of lemon zest and a good showering of Parmesan, which, adds all that umami flavor. But the brilliance is actually in the technique. So what you want to do is you want to get a big pot of water going and you want to salt it really well because you're going to cook your pasta and your asparagus in the same pot. So it's not like a double. There's still a couple of other dishes, but like everything gets boiled in the same pot. And you trim the sort of ends off of your asparagus, and then you also trim you trim the tips. So you're going to separate the stem from the tip. And so you'll take your asparagus stems and you'll cook those until they're soft and then transfer them to a blender or a food processor, anything that's going to help like whip them up. And then you'll also blanch your asparagus tips in the hot water for just a couple minutes until they're bright green, and then dunk them in cold water because you really want that shock of bright green asparagus to toss with your pasta. Then in the same pot of water, you'll add your pasta. What made me laugh about this recipe is that it actually calls for penne, which I know you really don't like that shape of pasta.
It's more Jonathan, my husband, who hates penne pasta, the shape, and it has prejudice towards it. I don't dislike
I had
it
never
as
heard of this until
much.
you said it.
And then it turns out we're not alone because we did get feedback that other people share this prejudice, but it's just that it's a lesser pasta to me than other pasta
Oh my
shapes.
gosh, it's so funny. Well, Faith Willinger calls for penne, but there's a couple of other recipes that call for something like a rigatoni,
Rigatoni.
a gemelli, a cavatappi.
Radiatori would be great.
Radiatori would be great. So any of those would be great here. So while your pasta's is cooking, you want to blend up your asparagus stems with a little bit of lemon zest and olive oil and some of the cooking liquid because you want to get it into this loose sauce. You only want to cook your pasta till it's cooked 3/4 and then reserve a little bit of your pasta water and then drain your pasta back into that pot. You add the pasta, a little bit of the pasta water, the saucy stems that you've blended, and you want to kind of cook that all together. And as it's kind of continuing to cook together, you add your like a big showering of Parmesan, and you want to bring it together till it's like a really glossy, delicious sauce. And then you just add your asparagus tips back to that. So you just basically have this bite-sized pasta with this really creamy, rich sauce that's really made out of asparagus and Parmesan. I think she developed this recipe like 20 years ago, and people still really love it. I think it's one of those spring rituals, pasta and asparagus.
I've never actually done this. My instinct is always to just blanch asparagus and keep it simple. I love this idea of the best of both worlds, which is make sauce with your asparagus, but also blanch the tops of it. So you get that very delicate, bright green asparagus, and then you get the cooked asparagus. And I love the idea of a simple sauce that doesn't require a ton of like butter and cream. This also sounds like a quick weeknight meal. I am definitely going to try this. I feel like as much as asparagus is central to spring, I also really love fennel this time of year. Fennel you can find in more than just spring, but I do see a lot of tender, smaller bulbs this time of year. And there's this food writer, Kolu Henry. I'm subscribed to her Substack, and she had a really interesting post a few weeks ago. It was about her and her friendship, her food friendship, with another recipe developer and food writer. And so the two of them text all the time, and they'll be like, what should I do with this dish? Should I add miso? You know, they sort of give each other hints and tips and things like that.
Just
But they
like
were
us. I love that.
just
It's
like
so
us.
sweet.
And they were texting, and they both realized they wanted to make dinner the same night with the same four ingredients: chicken, citrus, fennel, and olives. And they were
Ooh.
both talking about those four ingredients. And so they sort of decided, why don't we both write a recipe with these four ingredients and share it with our readers? So that was in a recent Substack, and it was a fennel chicken, olives, and citrus dish. And it is a one pot meal, more or less, because there's rice underneath the chicken. I wouldn't say it's like the easiest recipe in the world, but I think there's a lot of ways to just play around with these four ingredients and to have that combination of fennel and citrus, whether or not you have chicken. It's such a classic combination, whether you're just roasting fennel and drizzling an orange over it, or whether you make a shaved fennel salad with segments of orange and a lemon vinaigrette. All of those things this time of year really appeal to me. But for her recipe, she has you season the chicken with a lot of harissa paste, which you know is something
Oh,
I do with
you
my
love.
chicken
Yes.
all the time. And she has you start getting your chicken going. So you put that seasoned chicken in the oven and you're roasting it for about 20 minutes. While the chicken is roasting, you get out a big pan or skillet and you add your olive oil, and then you add fennel to that and you start kind of getting it all browned. And then to the fennel, you actually add grains of rice, like just white rice. And then so that the rice gets kind of toasty in the pan. And then you add stock. And so that's going to help cook the rice. And then by this point, you're going to add the chicken on top of this. And then you continue with a covered lid over the skillet or any kind of covering. You're cooking your rice and your chicken with this fennel all together. For her citrus, it was actually lemon zest and lemon juice. And the olives get kind of crushed into the rice and the chicken. And it seems like you could add them at different stages depending on what you prefer. But it's this beautiful caramelized fennel, chicken, rice, all in one pan sort of dish with all these complex flavors and spices. Again, I'm not advocating that this is like a super easy weeknight recipe, but
But
it
that's
is
okay. Yeah.
to me, it's a hosting recipe. Because
Yes.
also, when you do a dish like this, you can kind of time the putting it in the oven for when your guests arrive, because then
Yeah.
it buys you another half an hour of cooking time where you can have a drink or you can have an appetizer.
And it also perfumes your house with all of those flavors, which is
Right.
it's so comforting. And I love the brilliant tip of getting the chicken going in the oven while you're kind of working on taking the time to caramelize the fennel on your stovetop. Oh, and I
Yeah.
think what a great spring meal for sure. Well, Sonia, I have a really great spring pea salad, which I think most people love to have some kind of spring pea salad. But what I love about this one the most is that it uses three different kinds of peas. So, snap peas, which are crispy and delicious in the spring, snow peas, which you can generally find in most places, and then English peas, which, as you and I have already said, I would advocate using the bag of frozen peas here. And so, what you want to do with your snap peas and your snow peas is you want to blanch them. Just get a pot of water going, add some salt to it. The snap peas take like a second longer than the snow peas because the snow peas are a little bit thinner. So, I like to do mine separately. And then just let your English peas thaw out on the counter. And this recipe that I'm putting forth has walnuts and dates in it, which is kind of nice. It's nice to add some richness and a little bit of sweetness to it. But what's in the dressing that I really like is it has a little bit of cayenne pepper. All these peas are very sweet, but I think adding a little bit of cayenne pepper really kind of rounds it out a little bit. And what's great about this is that it can sit in your fridge for a couple of days and you can have it for your meal prep. But what I've done in the past too is I've actually made this into a saute. I've often done this with my clients for Passover. I'll get the snap peas and the snow peas blanched and set them to the side, let the English peas thaw out, and then you start your skillet with some leeks or some shallots, and then add your peas, get them tossed, get them a little bit warmed up, and then you can add your dates and your walnuts on top of that. And that's a really great side dish that also is like this shock of green on a table. And I feel like people always come up to me and they say like, "Oh wow, the vegetables are so..." It's just a really great way to showcase the freshness of the spring vegetables.
If I see sugar snap peas at the farmer's market, I'm always getting them. And I love a simple blanched sugar snap pea that you can combine with asparagus. I love it as the base of a salad. I love it raw. I love all the versions of it. You can then also take them and blister them in a cast iron
Yes,
skillet. You
yes.
could put that in a salad. There's a lot of ways to play with snap peas, but I've never made a triple bean salad with dates and walnuts. And I love both of those things in salads in general. This is a really smart and delicious combination. And I love the suggestion of it can work for meal prep. It can sit in your fridge. You could bring it to a party. You could bring it to a potluck. Because I think we're always looking for salads that can hold up for a while, that you don't have to get all wilty or that turn a weird color. And the cooking of the vegetables is what helps preserve them, hold their shape and hold that texture, because you're not getting them super soft. You're just getting them bright and vibrant and slightly tender.
Yeah, exactly. This is where you really want the crispest, tenderest vegetables for sure.
Yum. I'm definitely going to be trying that too. Well, I have to mention an ingredient that I know you don't like. And actually, you're not alone.
You're really outing me on the things that I don't like.
No, sometimes you out yourself. Sometimes I don't know you don't like something, and then I
This is true.
discover while we're talking. But this I preemptively sort of know you don't like, which is green garlic, which is really available in the spring when garlic is
Yeah.
starting to shoot out of the earth. And you've told me before that you find that green garlic is just an overpowering flavor for you, which for me, green garlic is so much mellower than regular garlic that I don't have that experience, but I understand that it can feel really strong. And in fact, like I said, you're not alone. My mom also does not like garlic. She does not. You like garlic, like
I
straight up
love
garlic.
garlic. I love like regular
Yeah.
garlic and I use a lot of it, but I feel like the green garlic is just something that I don't know. I think maybe because I just like garlic in its preserved version, I guess. Is that what you call it? Dried
Pure. I
garlic?
think it's
Cured?
cured. Yeah.
Okay.
But
But I
it,
think the green one
yeah.
is just like so herbaceous and it's not what I want.
I just love it. And it's another one of those things that I grab at the farmer's market. And also, I love to grow garlic. So if I have it in my garden, I take a couple stalks and use them for green garlic instead of
Yeah.
letting them mature. But there was this recipe I found from Wishbone Kitchen, who Wishbone Kitchen is the site of a personal chef in the Hamptons, although I don't think she's personal chefing anymore. And she writes really great recipes. And she has a salsa verde that she makes with green garlic. Although she does say you can make this with regular garlic. So for you, you could still make the salsa verde
Okay.
and you don't
Great.
have to use green
Good
garlic.
to know.
But it has a ton of parsley, mint, capers, or she says you can use those green olives,
Oh,
instead of
wow.
capers if you don't have that,
Yeah.
anchovies, and vinegar. And it's just almost like very finely chopped or lightly pureed. It's this vibrant green sauce. And then that makes an incredible topping for a piece of roasted salmon, for a grilled chicken breast, for flank steak, for pretty much any protein you can imagine. I think it would even be good on tofu, frankly, like crispy tofu. A spoonful of it could then be incorporated into creamy dressing for a salad if you like garlicky flavors. For me, having a way to use my green garlic in a special way was interesting because usually what I end up doing with green garlic is almost using it the way I would any garlic. Like I'll saute it as the base of a sauce or I'll add it to a pan of roasted vegetables. But I love the idea of making it even more special with a sauce.
Yeah, and I love all these flavors. This is a great way to elevate a protein and even including tofu because I think, having this herbaceous, capery, briny, I might even use green garlic in this just to see because I think then it could be more of a symphony of flavors. Those are all great flavors as opposed to having the green garlic sort of take over the whole relish. So I love this
Absolutely.
idea. Well, Sonia, I think I'm ready to pivot to a few sweet things. A lot of us are wooed by rhubarb. If you're at the farmer's market, rhubarb looks like celery, but it's often like hot pink. And I found this great recipe for a rhubarb tart that I really want to make because it involves puff pastry, frozen puff pastry. And what I also love about this recipe is that you don't even have to roll out your puff pastry. You just need to thaw it and then you lay it out onto your baking sheet with a little bit of parchment and brush it with a little bit of egg. And then with the tip of your paring knife, you make a 1-inch border. Don't cut all the way through. And then you use the tines of a fork and then dock it so that when you put it in the oven and bake it, you're basically going to have like a little box, this like cute little box where you can put your rhubarb in and all the other ingredients. And so while that's cooking in the oven, you trim your rhubarb, but leave it in its long stalks. This is a great place to get tender, hot pink rhubarb.
We get
And
super dark red rhubarb here too, actually. I think it might depend regionally too, because rhubarb grows really well in colder climates. So, yes, I agree with you. The darker or pinker, more colorful rhubarb, I'm always preferential to.
and the rhubarb is really highlighted in this tart. When you find that beautiful rhubarb, this is the place to use it. And so, in a baking dish, like a Pyrex or anything that will hold your rhubarb, you lay your rhubarb out and then you pour over it orange juice mixed with honey and a little bit of amaretto, which
Yep.
is an almond flavored liqueur. And so it adds like a little bit of flavor to your rhubarb. You cook that and you bake that in the oven for 10 to 15 minutes, and depending on the size of your rhubarb, just to get it soft. And so then when that comes out of the oven, you transfer your rhubarb stalks to your cutting board and you want to cut them maybe into thirds depending on how long they are. And then you take that juice, the orange juice mixed with the honey and the amaretto, and you want to boil that down and make it into a glaze. And so put that on the stove. What's great about this recipe is that none of it is very hard. It's really just an assembly, but it does require a few steps. So you boil that down and make it into a glaze. And then once your pastry has come out of the oven and is golden brown and it has this beautiful border around it, you take mascarpone cheese and mix it with a little bit of honey and a little bit of amaretto, and you spread that into your tart pan. And then you layer your rhubarb in a beautiful design. And the recipe also has a video. And so they show you how this like really beautiful design to put into your tart. And then you brush that with this glaze. And so then it's glistening and sweet.
This took a direction I wasn't expecting because when you first said a puff pastry rhubarb tart, I've made something like that before, but usually you're putting the rhubarb on the raw dough so that it's cooking with the pastry. And yes, you do that border so that the edges puff up while the
Yeah.
center kind of stays flatter. But I love the idea that you're cooking the rhubarb totally separately and infusing it with all those flavors. And in fact, like a poached rhubarb or simmered rhubarb is going to have a really different flavor than a roasted rhubarb. So I have never made a simple puff pastry tart like this. And I know that there are steps, but it's still simple because you're not having to make pastry. So it sounds really delicious and it sounds very elegant and sophisticated. The flavors with the amaretto. Again, amaretto is not something I use with rhubarb typically. I love this recipe. And I just think rhubarb this time of year is so exciting. For us in the Northwest, we don't have all the fruit that California has year round. So when the rhubarb appears, it's the very first, and it's not a fruit, but when it appears, it's like the very first thing to get you sort of in the mood for all these beautiful desserts and treats that are going to start in the coming months. Like we know strawberries are next after rhubarb, which is also what I have to bring up because strawberries are soon. Rhubarb is here. There is this cobbler that I made that I had to develop for one of my clients. And it comes from his base recipe. And it reminds me so much of the pudding cake recipe that you
Oh,
long ago
yeah.
shared with me. And I think cobbler can take on different meanings depending on the recipe. Sometimes cobblers are things that have a biscuit crust,
Yes.
right? And
But
sometimes
it can also be
cobblers,
like a cake.
it can also be like a cake.
Yes.
So his family recipe was much more in the cake territory. And it was so good. I gave some to our neighbors. One of our neighbors loves rhubarb. The wife loves rhubarb, but the husband hates it. But he always tells me, like, bring anything you make with rhubarb because she loves it so much it makes her happy. But he tried it and he loved it. And of course, there's strawberries in it. So I feel like if you're a little bit like, I don't know if I love the sourness of rhubarb, this might be a good gateway rhubarb recipe. And it's similar in some ways to what you're talking about because you take your rhubarb and your strawberries. And if you didn't have strawberries in season, quite yet in season, you could use frozen strawberries for this. So you cook your rhubarbs and strawberries in a pan with some sugar, a little lemon, very simple ingredients, and add some vanilla at the end. And you're just kind of softening them up. You're not trying to cook them for long. And then you are whipping together a batter while those are kind of simmering. And it's a really simple batter. It's like milk and flour and a little sugar.
Oh, wow.
Super
So
simple,
simple. Yeah.
very, very easy, no crazy equipment. And then the other part of the technique is you take your baking dish and you put butter in the dish and you preheat the dish with the butter in it in your oven.
Oh, wow.
So this is great for a ceramic baking dish, but you could use metal if that's all you had. You probably get away with cast iron for
I
this
was just
recipe.
thinking
Yeah.
the same thing. That's what I do for my cornbread is I
I
get
think
it
you could do the
heated.
same thing. And then so then that hot melted butter dish comes out of the oven and you pour the batter first into the dish and it starts to sizzle and then you top the strawberry rhubarb mixture on top and then stick it back in the oven to bake and the fruit sinks towards the bottom and the batter rises and gets all cakey and fluffy, but it has those like sweet little caramelized edges that are kind of syrupy and it's so fragrant with the strawberry and the rhubarb. It's one of my all-time favorite spring desserts.
I mean, this sounds genius, and it really speaks to the simplicity of this season. Strawberry rhubarb is such a classic combination that I think a lot of people look forward to in the spring. I can't imagine anything better than this.
If you're not an expert baker, I feel like this is a cobbler is an easy way to start
Yes.
baking.
Yeah, and like a scoop of that in a bowl with like a little
Whipped
bit of
cream,
vanilla,
ice
whipped cream,
cream,
ice cream, like
yum.
name it. Yeah, it sounds so great. I love thinking about all of the things that we're going to get to look forward to at the farmers market. And we have so many great recipes to take us through this season.
It's always exciting when it's the start of a new season, and it's just a really special time to be at the farmer's market.
Yeah. Well, until next time.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for being our food friend.
If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with friends. We love hearing from you, so follow us on Instagram or drop us a line at foodfriendspodcast.com.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you and your food friends. Happy cooking and eating.